everyone, Raptorspank here, and today we have Metacheck, November 24th. This is the show where I look at the meta and talk about a couple of decks I find interesting. First up, let's look at patch 1.15 real quick. No balance changes this time, but a couple of new things. For example, we have the new lab, which does sound like a very interesting new way to deck build, essentially. For this one, it sounds vaguely Commander-esque in a way, but very, very interesting. I like how it works essentially. So basically, just when your champion dies, the one champion your deck's built around, you can keep getting it back by killing something that your opponent has. There's also the new update to the round timer, so you can bank time essentially, give you more time later. So that's pretty good, especially for someone like me that tends to end my turns fairly quickly when I know I'm good. And don't need to waste any more time, so that'll be good for me. There's the new player profiles as well. That's pretty cool. I'll probably quickly check out mine too and show you guys that. They showed the card backs and the player icons for the seasonal tournaments. For people, if you play in it, you get the icon. If you manage to get 3 wins, you get this. There's a new board, the Snowy Glade, with a new Yeti Guardian and a new Yeti card back. And I think that's pretty much it. Yeah, so a couple of small things. Biggest thing being the addition of the round timer and player profiles. Player profiles are pretty cool. You just click on your icon here, and it brings up this whole thing where it has your cards, your champions, your favorite deck, which apparently mine is Ezreal Swain, and I kind of agree with that. How many guardians, card backs, boards, emotes you have, how many region roads you've completed, your current rank, your best rank, your collection, which apparently I'm still missing some rares from Rising Tide, so I'm a little bit surprised about that, but pretty close to collected them all before the next expansion comes out. But yeah, this is a pretty cool new feature that they have. Now let's just talk about the meta real quick. So a couple of things about the meta is right now it's getting to be a bit rock paper scissory again, but there's a couple of decks that can hold their own against most of the meta. I haven't seen a lot of Fiora Shen at the moment, but I hear that deck is still good and still doing well, so that's something to be reasonably concerned about. Although there's a handful of decks that play fairly well into it, like the Go Hard mid-range deck, which I have seen a ton of that. It's basically, I would say, probably 75 to 80% of my matches are against either Go Hard mid-range or discard aggro, with the other 20 to 25% being a random smattering of different decks, from Fuel Rush to Anivia Control, things like that. So the meta's kind of stagnating a bit, but it's a little more interesting. Go Hard's a weird deck, but not necessarily the worst deck to be playing against. Discard aggro is still a little bit frustrating. I don't know, again, why when it was posting the best numbers, or some of the best numbers out of all the decks, they chose to buff it, but it was a terrible mistake. We're still paying for it. I actually don't think the deck is that bad, but I do think that the addition of being able to generate rockets on the turn you play Jinx is bad for the game. I think it's pretty unhealthy, besides the fact that someone was able to immediately exploit that into like an infinite win combo. But just in general, I don't think that was necessary. I don't think the deck needed that. I don't think it needed a buff, so I think that's a mistake. But there's a lot of decks that can work well against discard aggro because of how fragile its units are, which is why I tend to avoid the deck, because of how easy it is to just wipe the board against them. But it does present one of the fastest wins, so that's still out there, still a big thing. But there is a lot of room for some more interesting decks, and I'll talk about a few of them. But there's things like Vimer Control is good right now, and just a couple of interesting decks like that are good into a number of matchups. 3 of which I think I have today. I think all 3 of these decks can do pretty well against most of the other decks in the format, or at least hold their own even in bad matchups. So first up, we have Anivia Control. This is a solid late-game control deck that holds up well into the current meta. It looks to establish a handful of late-game Anivias and grind your opponent out with Anivia triggers, essentially. It uses Rekindlers and Harrowing to bring back Anivias that you've lost, and to build even more, so you have multiple Anivias, and the triggers kill your opponent a lot quicker. You basically want to look for heavy, low-cost removal against aggro, and then essentially we're talking stuff like Go Hard, Withering Wail, Avalanche, Vile Feast. Tavern Keep's also really great for gaining life. You don't really want to worry about winning against aggro decks. You just want to focus on not dying because your late game is substantially better than theirs. So they also have a hard time removing Anivia, so you can actually just play Anivia and start swinging fairly early as well, which will kind of work as establishing your own win condition, but also is just a solid removal piece essentially by dealing 1 to the enemy unit, which, as I mentioned, really good against stuff like discard aggro. But generally speaking, you just want to focus on dealing with your opponent rather than establishing your own win, because you'll get there eventually. Against mid-range, you want to look for hard removal. This is Vengeance, Ruination, stuff like that. Tavern keeps really good because it can heal you and also can trade with most things mid-range, most mid-range threats. And early Anivias aren't necessarily bad either because they'll slowly chunk through your opponent's units with Anivia triggers. And even if it dies, that's fine. You can play things like Rekindler. Rekindler's great because you get 2 bodies for 1. That's also good for fighting the board with them. So that's really what you're looking for the mid-range matchups. And then into control, you want hard removal for their threats. This could be anything from 1 Ruination or 1 Vengeance, something like that. To then you also want plenty of ways to bring back your Anivia, because they'll have plenty of ways to kill it. But with a bunch of Harrowraiths and Rekindlers, you should be able to keep Anivia coming back. Not to mention they have to double up removal to actually kill Anivia, so you should be able to run them out of removal eventually. So plenty of ways to bring back Anivia is a great way to play it. You also kind of want the one of Anivia or Entreat into that matchup. This deck is much more about playing around your opponent's deck rather than playing for your deck, but generally speaking, eventually you want to flip the script and start getting many Anivias out, so that's ultimately our plan, but you really want your opponent's board to be under control by then, essentially. This also matches up extraordinarily well against Go Hard midrange because we don't necessarily have a lot of units for them to hit with Go Hard, and we have lots of life gain to basically deal with the Go Hard damage, and then eventually we get all of our Niveas out, and that just should shred through them. Basically, the only thing they can do is like pack your bags at that point, but if we play well, they shouldn't be able to pack your bags, the term we say harrowing or something like that, and by clearing their board, we can present a fairly quick kill. Next up is Leona Sol Invoke midrange. This is a value-based midrange deck focused on strong Daybreak units combined with Celestial cards. This is very versatile with aggressive units backed with a utility. We have lots of life gain, we have some pump spells, we have some other random utility spells like Hush, for example. Aurelion Soul, Leona, or Celestials like the Great Beyond are our primary win conditions of the deck. Against aggro, you kind of want to look for early units, combat tricks, and life gain. Count on your stronger late game to carry the win, so you don't necessarily need to worry about trying to win early. You can just keep trading with their units and just count on having the better late game, because generally speaking, you will. Another great trick is that some aggro decks don't have great removal, or if you have something with 4 health, most aggro decks can't kill that, which means Judgment can actually be huge in this matchup, but generally speaking, since it's so expensive, I probably wouldn't keep it in my starting hand, but it's not necessarily a bad thing, especially if you can combine it with something like Golden Sisters. Versus other mid-range decks, you want to look for powerful Celestials, Leona, and combat tricks like Cascade or Judgment. Generally speaking, if you time things right, you should be able to surprise your opponent with some of these things, and pump spells can help you force a trade or save your own unit while killing theirs. And then Celestial units are just usually very, very strong and very, very hard for other mid-range decks to deal with. Golden Sisters, for example, gives you 2 units for the price of 1, one of which has Elusive, so that can go over most mid-range decks to keep forcing damage through. Big things like the Great Beyond or the Scourge are very hard for them to deal with and buff all your other stuff, or just in general have that added protection with Spell Shield, so those are also really, really great into the matchup, so that's generally how you want to play that. For control, you want a very aggressive start backed by Celestials. Soldier into Shieldbearer into Leona is very, very strong, and then Spell Shield units like Aurelion Sol or the Great Beyond are very difficult for your opponent to deal with and force them to use 2 pieces of removal on each one, so that's another great way to try and basically close out the game against them. All in all, the goal is to develop board and close out with Celestials. It holds up fairly well against the rest of the meta since we have healing for the aggro matchups, we have Spell Shield for the control matchups, and against other mid-range we have a combination of powerful Celestial abilities like the Obliterates, as well as the fact that we have Hush can be very, very swingy for a deck, and Leona stuns also are great for forcing damage through and trying to outrun them. So, all in all, it's actually a pretty solid list for the metagame. Finally, we have the new style that people are really playing, which is the Shadow Isles Targon Harrowraiths. This is an amalgamation of Ender tokens and Season 1 Mistwraiths. It's a potent, fearsome-based aggro deck with powerful combo pieces like Risen Mist. Pale Cascade plus Stalking Shadows helps to keep your hand full. Harrowing gives you a potent one-turn kill, essentially. And with things like Wraithcaller in there, Harrowing can actually get you permanent units, potentially. Against aggro, you basically want to look to match their board, backed with Doombeast Life Gain or something like that. You can also use... You can play defensively because you know that you could have a Harrowing to get everything back, so you can trade all of your units with theirs, then Harrowing to kill them that turn. That's a really good way to play it, especially if you can get the Harrowing down early, like turn 6, turn 7. So that's the one nice thing, is we can play a bit like a mid-range deck and then just combo kill them once their board is wiped. For mid-range, strong fearsome threats, pump spells, and Skitterer to shrink blockers is really good, because in that case, they're usually going to be able to match our threats, and that can be problematic. But if we're trading, then potentially Harrowing will win us the game out of nowhere. But in general, having pump spells to stay ahead of their stuff or to force damage through early is really strong. Skitterer shrinking their stuff is also really strong, because a lot of mid-range decks they'll have the ability to match your units, but they'll be at 3 power. So if you play Skitterer, you'll shrink everything, and then you can force the damage through while they can't block. Into control, you want to be extremely aggressive and look to find a great Harrowing window, potentially as early as turn 6, because at turn 6, usually they don't have a lot of ways to deal with your deck, especially if you're already being aggressive at that point. Then they kind of have to use their mana to answer your threats up to that point, so they shouldn't have 9 mana, whereas you can get 9 mana while staying aggressive and get that early Harrowing, and that will surprise a lot of control players and just be too much for them to deal with, at least that early into the game. All in all, it's a surprisingly powerful aggro shell for being essentially mono Shadow Isles. This is kind of what I expected Risen Mist to be, but it never really got the chance. Piltover removal can be pretty bad. Vimer Control's a bit of a scary matchup because of the combination of Hush and a lot of damage-based removal that matches up well against our threats, but generally speaking, I think this deck has a very solid chance against most of the meta and can be very powerful and just run down your opponent very quickly. So it's very good if you're trying to grind out the end of the season. So, thanks for watching the video. There's a link for all 3 of these decks in the description below if you want to give them a try. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like, comment below, and subscribe for more videos just like it.